Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The girl was 12 when her mother left her in the mountains with nothing but a rusted key and a lie about coming back. 3 winters had passed since then. 15 now. Luz lived in the abandoned shepherd's cabin her mother had pointed to before driving away in a stranger's truck. And the only thing that had returned were the seasons, cruel and indifferent, teaching her what family never had. The cabin leaked. The roof tiles cracked under snow, and when spring came, water ran down the walls like the place itself was weeping. Luz patched the holes with tree bark and moss, her hands small and efficient, moving with the terrible competence of children who raise themselves. She trapped rabbits. She knew which mushrooms would feed her and which would end her suffering, and on the darkest nights she studied both kinds with equal interest. She had learned not to go down to the village. The first year she'd tried, walked 4 miles through pine forests to the plaza where tourists photographed the colonial church and bought empanadas from street vendors. She'd stood outside the bakery, hollow-eyed and dirt-streaked, and watched a woman pull her daughter close and hurry past. The baker had called the police. 2 officers came, asked questions Luz couldn't answer without implicating her mother, and when they left, the village whispered, "La Niña Salvaje," the wild girl. No one came up the mountain after that. Not to help. Not to check if she'd frozen or starved or simply disappeared into the forest like smoke, but she had something they didn't: the land around the cabin. 40 acres of pine and stone, and a spring that never dried belonged to no one. Her mother had said so. Abandoned property forgotten by the government, too remote for anyone to want. Luz claimed it the way animals claim territory, by surviving on it, by knowing every deer trail and hidden cave, by bleeding into its soil when she fell and feeding it when she buried her scraps. She was not happy, but she was not dead, and in the hierarchy of terrible lives, this counted as victory. The stranger appeared on the first day of October when the aspens burned gold and the air tasted like smoke and snow. Luz was checking her snares near the spring when she heard coughing, wet, desperate coughing that echoed through the trees. She froze, rabbit in hand, listening. The sound came again, closer, followed by the crack of branches breaking under heavy weight. She knew the smart thing: run, hide, wait for danger to pass. But curiosity had kept her alive as often as caution. So she crept toward the sound, moving through underbrush like wind through grass. The man was collapsed against a pine tree, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other clutching a leather satchel to his chest like it contained his soul. He was old, 60, maybe 70, with silver hair and expensive clothes torn by thorns. His face was gray. His breathing sounded like gravel in a tin can. Luz watched him from behind a boulder. He didn't see her. His eyes were closed, and he was whispering something in a language that wasn't Spanish or English, syllables that sounded like prayer or curse or both. She should leave him. The world had left her. Balance demanded she return the favor. But then she noticed his shoes. Leather, hand-stitched, the kind her mother had cleaned in rich people's houses before she cleaned nothing because she was gone. And his satchel had brass buckles that caught the slanting sunlight. And his watch, visible beneath a torn sleeve, looked like it cost more than a year of her mother's wages. Luz knew opportunity when it stumbled. Dying into her woods. She stepped into the clearing, and the man's eyes snapped open. They were dark and sharp despite the pain, and they assessed her in one sweep. Small, filthy, feral, female, alone. She saw him calculate these facts and dismiss her as threat. Good. People underestimated the powerless. It was the only advantage she had. ¿Estás perdido? She asked. Are you lost? He nodded, tried to speak, coughed instead, and blood flecked his lips. Ven. She gestured toward the path. Come. He stared at her like she was a ghost or hallucination. Then he tried to stand, failed, and crumpled sideways into the pine needles. Luz sighed. She was strong for her size. Survival had carved her into rope and sinew, but he was twice her weight. And the cabin was half a mile uphill. She took his arm. Pulled. He gasped, but helped where he could. And together they moved through the forest in agonizing increments, his arm across her shoulders, her body taking his weight, both of them breathing hard in the thin mountain air. By the time they reached the cabin, twilight had turned the world purple, and the man was barely conscious. Luz kicked the door open and guided him to the only furniture she owned, a wooden cot covered in rabbit pelts. He collapsed onto it and didn't move. She built up the fire, boiled water from the spring, found the dried herbs she'd learned to use, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, elderflower for fever. She mixed them into tea, then crouched beside him and lifted his head. Toma, she said. Drink. His eyes opened. He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed through his expression. Surprise, recognition, something else she couldn't name. Then he drank. While he slept, Luz examined his belongings. The satchel contained papers covered in numbers and official stamps, a leather-bound book written in that strange language, a photograph of a young woman who looked like she'd never known hunger, and a wallet thick with cards and cash. So much cash she could take it. He was weak, maybe dying. She could take the money and disappear down the mountain before dawn, but she didn't. She couldn't explain why. Maybe because she'd spent 3 years invisible, and being seen, even by a dying stranger, felt like proof she still existed. Maybe because stealing felt like admitting her mother had been right to leave. Maybe because the man had looked at her with something other than pity or disgust, and she was so starved for human acknowledgement that even a stranger's grateful glance felt like water to roots. Or maybe because some part of her, the part that still remembered being a child instead of a survivor, wanted to practice being someone who helped instead of someone who stole. She returned his things to the satchel and went outside to skin the rabbit. The man woke at dawn. Luz heard him stirring and brought him more tea, along with roasted rabbit and wild onions. He ate slowly, studying her over the wooden cup, and when he finished, he spoke in careful Spanish with an accent she didn't recognize. ¿Cómo te llamas? Luz. Light, he said in English, then back to Spanish. Apropiado. Appropriate. She shrugged. Names were what you were called before you were forgotten. I am Jakob, he said. You saved my life, Luz. Why? She didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain instinct or loneliness, or the way his expensive shoes had sparked something like hope. That wealth and powerlessness could occupy the same moment, and maybe, just maybe, she could leverage one against the other. You live here alone? He asked, looking around the cabin with visible dismay. The cracked walls, the leaking roof, the dirt floor, the absence of everything that made a place a home instead of a shelter. See, your family? No, hey, there is none. Something shifted in his face. He set down the cup and leaned forward, wincing at the pain in his ribs. How long? 3 years. The silence that followed felt heavy as stones. Jakob stared at her and she stared back, refusing to flinch or explain or beg for sympathy. She had survived. That was her only credential. "This land," he said finally. "Who owns it?" "Nady. No one. You're certain?" She nodded. She'd walked every inch of it, looking for owners or signs or reasons she might be forced to leave. But the cabin was too old, the records too faded, and the mountain too far from anything anyone cared about. Jakob reached for his satchel with shaking hands and pulled out the leather book. He opened it to a page covered in hand-drawn maps and numbers, then turned it toward her. "Can you read?" "A little." Her mother had taught her before teaching became inconvenient. "This," he tapped the page, "is a survey map. He paused, choosing words. "I look for land, hidden places, places forgotten by governments but remembered by the earth. I buy them, protect them." Luz frowned. "Why?" "Because everything beautiful is being destroyed," he said simply. "Because my daughter loved mountains and she's gone, and I have money but no one to leave it to. Because protecting what's left is the only legacy worth having." He looked at her when he said daughter, and Luz understood. He was burying someone in these mountains. Not literally, but every tree he saved, every acre he protected, these were monuments to a ghost. She recognized the architecture of grief. She lived in it. "This land," Jakob continued, pulling out a paper covered in official stamps. "I want to buy it. The cabin, the forest, the spring, all of it. But I'm sick, Luz. My heart is failing. I came up here to see the property before finalizing the purchase and—" He gestured at his collapsed body, the blood on his shirt. "I would have died if not for you." Luz said nothing. Her mind was racing. If he bought the land, what happened to her? Would she be evicted from the only home she had? Would he report her to authorities who would drag her to orphanages or foster homes or worse? Jakob seemed to read her fear. He closed the book and met her eyes. "I want to buy this land," he said, "and give you 1 acre. The cabin, the spring, and enough forest to live. Legal title. Your name on the deed. You would own it. No one could take it from you." The words didn't make sense. Luz stared at him, waiting for the trap, the condition, the price she couldn't afford to pay. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you are 15 and alone, and you gave shelter to a dying man when you could have let the mountain take him. Because you have survived what would have killed most adults. Because my daughter would have been your age this year, and if she had lived, I would want someone to help her." His voice cracked. "And because no child should have to live like this." Luz felt something dangerous rising in her chest. Hope, that stupid thing, that killer of the cautious. She forced it down. "What do you want in return?" "Help me," Jakob said. "Help me walk down the mountain to my car. Help me complete this purchase before my heart gives out. If I die, there's a lawyer whose name is in my book. Find him. He'll ensure the deed is transferred. And if you don't die—" Jakob smiled, thin and tired. "Then I buy this land tomorrow and you become its guardian." It was too easy, too good. But Luz had learned that refusing help because it seemed impossible was just another way of dying slowly. So she nodded. They rested that day. Jakob's breathing improved with the herbs, and color returned to his face. He asked her about the land, where the deer trails ran, where the spring emerged from rock, which trees were oldest. She told him, and he wrote everything in his book with shaking hands, treating her knowledge like it mattered, like it was worth recording. That night, he told her about his daughter. Her name had been Rebecca. She'd died in a climbing accident in the Alps 2 years ago. She'd been 23, brilliant, passionate about conservation. Jakob had been building a property empire to leave her dozens of forests and mountains, protected forever. When she died, the empire lost its purpose. Now he just bought land to keep it from being destroyed, to keep her memory alive in living things. Lus listened and said nothing. She didn't know how to respond to grief that big. Her own was smaller, dirtier. Abandonment instead of tragedy. Loss through choice instead of accident. But maybe all grief was the same at its core. The stubborn refusal to accept that someone was gone. At dawn, they began the descent. Jakob leaned on her like he'd leaned on her that first day, and they picked their way down the mountain trails, stopping often to rest. It took 6 hours to reach the dirt road where his car was parked, a massive black vehicle that looked absurd beside the wild landscape. Jakob collapsed into the driver's seat, breathing hard. Then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a phone. Within minutes, he was speaking rapidly in that other language, Hebrew, he'd told her, summoning lawyers and surveyors and officials. Luz stood beside the car, overwhelmed by the speed at which her life was changing, terrified it would all dissolve like morning mist. But Jakob made calls for 2 hours, and when he finished, he turned to her with exhaustion and triumph mingled on his face. "Tomorrow," he said. "The purchase completes tomorrow. And your acre, it's already in the contract. 1 acre surrounding the cabin and spring. In your name. Legal and permanent." Luz couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She'd spent 3 years owning nothing, not even the certainty of another sunrise, and now this stranger was giving her land. "Why?" she asked again, because she still didn't understand. Jakob looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Because you are what Rebecca would have wanted to become. Strong and kind and impossible to break. Because you gave without expecting return. Because," he stopped, choosing words carefully. "Because we are both guardians now, Luz. You of this mountain, me of her memory. We understand each other." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick stack of bills. "For supplies, for repairs, for whatever you need. And tomorrow, when the deed is signed, you'll receive an account with enough money to live. Not wealth, but enough. You won't have to trap rabbits to survive." Luz took the money with shaking hands. It felt like stolen treasure, like something that would be taken back the moment she turned around. But Jakob just smiled, a real smile this time, tired but genuine, and started the car. "I'll return tomorrow with the lawyers," he said. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow you stop being invisible." He drove away, and Luz stood on the dirt road for a long time, watching dust settle, feeling the weight of bills in her pocket and the heavier weight of impossible hope in her chest. She walked back up the mountain as sunset painted the pines orange and gold. The cabin looked different now, not a prison but a kingdom, 1 acre of sovereignty in a world that had offered her nothing. She built up the fire, cooked the last of her stored food, and lay on the rabbit pelt staring at the ceiling where stars showed through cracks. For the first time in 3 years, Luz allowed herself to imagine a future, not just survival, something more. Something like a life. Jakob returned at noon the next day with 3 lawyers, a surveyor, and documents that covered the cabin's table in a papery avalanche. Luz stood in the corner still disbelieving, while men in expensive suits measured her forest and spoke in technical language about property lines and deeds and legal protections. The head lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Christina, pulled Luz aside. "You understand what's happening?" she asked in gentle Spanish. Luz shook her head. Christina smiled. Senor Hirsch is purchasing 40 acres of mountain land for conservation. He's creating a nature preserve that can never be developed, never be logged, never be destroyed. And you, she touched Luz's shoulder carefully, like touching something fragile, are receiving 1 acre as a gift. The cabin, the spring, and the forest immediately surrounding them. It's yours forever. Why? Luz whispered, the question she couldn't stop asking. Because you saved his life, Christina said. And because he's dying, and he wants to do something good with the time he has left. The words hit like stones. Dying? His heart. He has months, maybe a year. He's spending it buying land and protecting it. You're not the first person he's helped, but... Christina paused. You might be the one that matters most to him. They completed the paperwork as autumn light slanted through the cabin windows. Luz signed documents she barely understood, her name appearing in official places for the first time since her mother had abandoned her, with no birth certificate, no school records, no proof she existed beyond her own stubborn breathing. When it was finished, Christina handed her a folder. Your copy, she said. This proves the land is yours. Don't lose it. Luz clutched the folder like it contained her soul. Maybe it did. Jacob stayed after the lawyers left. He was weaker than yesterday, his face gray despite his smile. He walked with Luz around her acre, marking the boundaries with GPS coordinates, showing her where her land ended and his preserve began. You'll be the guardian here, he said, pausing by the spring, where water bubbled clear and cold from mountain stone. Watch over it. Keep it wild. If developers come, if the government tries to seize it, fight them. Promise me. I promise. He nodded, satisfied. Then he pulled out his leather book and tore out a page, the one with his daughter's photograph. He handed it to Luz. Keep this, he said. Remember that protection is love. Remember that the land doesn't need us, but we need it. Remember that you were strong enough to survive alone, and now you're strong enough to help others. Luz looked at the photograph. Rebecca had dark curls and her father's sharp eyes and a smile that suggested she'd never encountered a mountain she couldn't climb. I'll remember, Luz said. Jacob reached into his satchel one final time and pulled out a sealed envelope. If I die before I return, he said, give this to Christina. It contains instructions for additional funds and for connecting you with other young people I've helped. You won't be alone anymore, Luz, I promise. But he was lying, and they both knew it. He wasn't coming back. He left as the sun touched the ridge, and Luz watched him descend the trail with careful steps, one hand on his chest, the other gripping his satchel. He didn't look back, maybe because he knew that if he did, he'd see her crying, and he'd already seen too many people cry. Luz stood by the spring until darkness came, holding the photograph and the envelope and the deed that proved she existed. Then she went inside, built up the fire, and allowed herself to weep, not from grief, but from the terrible, overwhelming relief of being seen, being helped, being given a future by a dying man who expected nothing in return. Winter came early that year. Snow fell in thick curtains, and Luz used Jacob's money to buy supplies. Real supplies, not scraps and stolen goods. She repaired the cabin roof with proper tiles. She bought blankets and food and books. She learned to read better, studying by firelight, absorbing knowledge like her life depended on it because maybe it did. Jacob died in December. Christina came up the mountain to tell her, bringing the envelope and more documents and tears that froze on her cheeks. The funeral had been in Israel, she said. He was buried beside his daughter. His entire fortune had been divided between land conservation and young people he'd helped. 12 in total, across 4 countries, all of them alone and resourceful and stubborn like Luz. He left you more, Christina said, handing over papers. A trust fund. Enough for university when you're ready. Enough to maintain the land. Enough to never be hungry again. Luz took the papers numbly. Wealth felt abstract, meaningless. What mattered was the cabin, the spring, the forest. These things were real. These things were hers. He was a good man, Christina said. Yes, Luz agreed, though good felt insufficient. Jakob had been something more. A guardian angel who appeared dying and left her living, who turned invisibility into sovereignty, abandonment into inheritance. Spring arrived like a promise kept. Luz planted a garden using seeds Christina brought, working the soil with her hands, learning to grow food instead of just hunting and gathering it. The land responded to care the way all neglected things do, with explosive, grateful abundance. She was not alone anymore. Christina visited monthly. Other young people from Jakob's network wrote letters sharing their stories of survival and rescue. Luz wrote back, discovering that loneliness could be cured by connection to people who understood what it meant to be discarded and then salvaged. On the anniversary of meeting Jakob, Luz hiked to the highest point of her acre, a rocky outcrop where the entire valley spread below like a rumpled green blanket. She carried Rebecca's photograph and a jar of spring water and words she'd practiced saying. "I'm still here," she told the sky. The photograph. The memory of a dying man who'd bought a mountain to keep his daughter's ghost company. "I'm the guardian now. I won't let anyone destroy this. I promise." The wind moved through the pines, and for a moment, Luz could swear she heard 2 voices in it. One low and tired, one young and laughing, both saying the same thing. Good. Live well. Protect what you love. She stayed on the outcrop until sunset, watching light pour gold across the forest Jakob had saved. The cabin she'd defended. The spring that never dried. She was 16 now, almost an adult, no longer abandoned but chosen, no longer invisible but seen by a stranger who'd recognized her worth, by a forest that sheltered her, by a future that had seemed impossible until she gave shelter to a dying man and received a kingdom in return. Luz descended the mountain as stars emerged, her hands rough from work, her heart full of the kind of wealth that can't be bought, only earned through survival and generosity and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty win. She was the guardian now. She was home. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what matters. Watch our other videos. Share with someone who needs to remember that kindness returns tenfold. See you next time.